welcome to Future Talk. The Internet has become the backbone of global commerce and communications, but it's still very vulnerable to fraud, theft, and sabotage, which can cause enormous losses to large corporations and government agencies, as well as private individuals. On today's program, we're going to discuss the kind of cyber threats posed by hackers and what's being done to thwart them. I have two guests. Chris Porter is Chief Executive Officer of Training Camp, which provides subsidized training and certification programs for IT and cybersecurity professionals, most of whom will end up working in the government or defense sectors. In the 16 years of its existence, Training Camp has trained and certified about 100,000 cyber warriors. David Schefter is Chief Technology Officer of Ziften Technologies, which develops cybersecurity software for commercial companies. Previously, he was Senior Vice President of Innovation and Emerging Technology at Citigroup. Chris, David, I'd like to welcome both of you to the program today.
Pleasure to be on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Chris, let's talk a little bit about the government sector. What are some of the major cyber threats that government agencies need to worry about today?
Well, there's no shortage of problems. There's no shortage of concern. Looking back to 9/11, I recognized the fragility of our infrastructure, where a single plane can bring down two buildings and cause massive harm to our economy. A cyber attack, much like a physical attack, has a similar capacity, if not a greater capacity, to incur significant damage to our infrastructure, our economy, and the overall morale and efficacy of our country. If you look at some of the areas that are likely to be attacked and certainly have weakness, you've got things like our power grids, nuclear power plants. A lot of competitive advantage that this country has centers around aerospace technology, and the theft of that intellectual property certainly puts other actors, evil actors like China, for example, at a competitive advantage to us. Air traffic control, similar to what happened at 9/11, but something orchestrated by a cyber attack, is something far within the realm of capability.
So we're talking about outright sabotage, destroying airplanes in the sky,
Sure.
But also just stealing information. There was recently a big hack, some people are accusing the Chinese government, in which millions of personal records of U.S. government employees were stolen. Many people in the intelligence service. What's the potential harm of that?
Well, the concern there is the breadth and depth of information that was taken. There were ranging from social security numbers to financial behaviors to government interviews that ask things like sexual orientation and very specific psychological profiling. Any of this information that evil actors for external countries that are less than friendly to the United States can certainly use this information to secure additional information that puts us at significant disadvantage.
Now, do you think that the U.S. government is taking this problem seriously enough in doing everything it should be doing, or are the hackers just too smart or just too many steps ahead?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. In the last year or two, there's been no shortage of headlines, whether it's private enterprises, whether it's government institutions like the Office of Personnel Management. Clearly attacks, malicious attacks, cyber attacks are in the news. There is awareness. The problem is there's a significant shortage of capability and skill set and cyber warriors and resource to be able to thwart these threats.
And you're training people for that.
It's exactly what we do, yes.
Now, are the people you training working with existing software, or are they creating new software? How do you deal with the threat? What's the approach in warding off the threat?
Well, you have to look at information security as in more of a holistic type approach. There is securing your existing infrastructure. There is improving your infrastructure through a number of things, including basic things like patching your existing technologies. When you do an upgrade with a Windows, for example, you want to make sure that all of the vulnerabilities that are consistently found are being upgraded so that your systems are currently ready and less likely to be vulnerable to attack. Yeah.
Now, how does somebody get in? Is it like they get somebody's login information and they log on as somebody who works for the organization and gain the access that that person would be able to get normally?
Yeah, they certainly can. The password is certainly the gateway to a lot of your personal security. There are a number of mistakes that the individuals or organizations make, one of which being setting password policies that simply aren't aggressive enough. Using password 123 may seem ridiculous, but it's all too common in organizations. Certainly the second is having the same password for a too lengthy a period of time. Believe it or not, a lot of the more basic information security holes come from things that you would expect or imagine would be sort of second nature and obvious. But a lack of overall software or information security assurance and awareness training really is what a lot of these issues run into.
And I think if there's one weak spot, one vulnerability, the hackers can exploit that vulnerability to get into the entire system.
They absolutely can. If you have an organization with 1,000 computers and only one of them has not been patched, well, the other 999 have been, you've got an open organization, open to hacking and open to being exploited.
Now, do the smartest programmers tend to work for the good guys or the bad guys?
I think the short answer is yes.
So as far as the talent on each side of it, it can be roughly comparable.
Absolutely.
The people who are trying to break into your system are probably equally smart to the people who are trying to prevent you from breaking in.
I don't think the skill set is different. I think the motivation is different. But the lack of education on both sides is certainly there.
Do you see this as a conflict that eventually will be won?
I don't. I think that over time there will be an increase in things like encryption technology, and encryption technology will likely be won or lost with things like quantum computing, for example. And there will be a point where information technology assets can be secured when governments like the United States have the raw computing power to make sure that the evil actors aren't able to keep up. There will be a window of time when we have superiority, but as with any technology, it becomes ubiquitous, and we sort of end up back where we start.
So where do you think it's going to go from here? Like, the technology is constantly changing. If the technology were mature and static, maybe it could be hardened so no one can break in. But there's always a new version of the operating system being released, which maybe has new holes in it, which people can exploit.
Yeah, we internally call it the Microsoft Excel effect. I can still use Microsoft Excel from 15 years ago and do 99% of what I need to do, but I've gotten, the ability to buy another 15 versions since then. And each one gives you a little bit of additional functionality, but it also brings a little bit of vulnerability. And that's what we look at. There's an element of feature creep and consistent growth in the expectations of applications and systems, and things like bring your own device and bringing my cell phone into an organization and expecting to have third-party applications that aren't part of my chief security officer's policy certainly brings additional exposure to my organizations as a vulnerability.
Or if someone brings in a flash drive and just plugs it in to use it, maybe it contains some malicious software that he didn't know was there.
It happens all too often.
Now, what if there's an inside man in the organization, somebody who's working for the bad guys unbeknownst to you? Is there any way to protect against that if there's an agent inside your group?
Well, the best you can do is assigning roles and responsibilities. Certainly from a database access standpoint, you try to make sure that the actors that are in play in your organization have the rights. But you look at somebody like an Edward Snowden, who was not directly an employee of the government, but certainly had access to classified information. It's just a matter of making sure the human capital that you have should have the rights and should have the access to information that isn't going to cause you harm if used in a negative way.
Now, what role do personal relationships and personal trust play in cybersecurity? Can we be made safe just by having sufficiently clever software? Or does it ultimately depend on knowing who you can trust?
I think it's a little bit of both, but in my experience, a background check is probably as valuable to any organization as any antivirus software that you could roll out, for sure.
Now, military issues are pretty important because the U.S. is a leader in many types of military software. You spend years and years and billions of dollars developing some new equipment, and somebody just steals the plans of it, costs them next to nothing.
Sure, and it happens all the time. And really all that we can do is try to continue to secure our systems, and unfortunately you have to recognize that any data that's made available connected to a router on the internet is highly likely to be accessible to some bad actor.